union jobs. And this is a way to do that to prevent privatization.
But maybe, or did you?
I have two real quick ones. One, earlier before we started recording, you said that this was an important issue on a national level. Could you explain why the incinerator's future is important on a national scale?
And the Detroit incinerator has always been very important on the national scene. When it was initially proposed in the 1980s, the Detroit incinerator and the fight done by the Evergreen Alliance was absolutely critical for what happened around the rest of the country. Even though if you will, the battle was lost in Detroit, it set the stage for defeating so many other incinerators around the country. And so what happened in terms of incinerators is they started getting built and they peaked in the early 1990s once it became very clear just how much of a disaster the Detroit incinerator was. And there hasn't been a new incinerator of this traditional type of incinerator built in quite some time. What that means is that there was this big influx of construction of incinerators in the late 80s and very early 90s. Most of those were set up with 20-year contracts. So what is happening now is that the Detroit incinerator is one of the earliest of all these different facilities around the country that are now coming up for these contract renewals. And one of the fears for a lot of activists around the country is that many of those other facilities have continued to be public facilities. The Detroit facility ended up becoming a privately owned facility shortly after its construction because of the financial crisis of the city of Detroit, much of which was precipitated by the construction of the facility. And I'll just mention as an aside here that I've calculated that if the city of Detroit had never built the Detroit incinerator, they would have saved, over the course of the 20-year contract of the facility, the city would have saved more than $1 billion on their trash disposal. In fact, it would probably be closer to about $1.2 to $1.4 billion over the course of those 20 years. And you can directly attribute that to all the financial crises that the city of Detroit has had over the last 20 years. So all these other communities are now facing these facilities coming up with their contract renewals. And they fear that what's going to end up happening is that many of these facilities that have continued to be operated publicly are going to be privatized, much like what happened with the city of Detroit incinerator, and that the same kind of contractual agreements that has held the city of Detroit hostage to maintaining its facility because of those private agreements is going to happen in these other communities. And so there's now a national movement that's happening around 2 points: the renewal of the existing facilities, but the trash, or I should say the waste industry, is now starting a new effort to try and build a whole new generation of trash incinerators. And a number of those have popped up in Michigan. There's a strong effort to try and build one of these new-fangled incinerators in Macomb County, for example. Those new facilities go under various names, but what I usually refer to them as gasifying incinerators, because they use some kind of technology to basically break all the garbage down into its constituent atoms, sort those atoms based on whether they're heavy atoms that go into a slag-like material or lighter atoms that are then siphoned off as a gas. The slag contains all the same heavy metals, many of the toxics that the slag and ash of a traditional incinerator has. So you still have that as a fundamental problem. These new-fangled incinerators go under various names of pyrolysis, plasma arc, catalytic cracking, but they all have the same basic feature, is that they basically break everything down into its constituent atoms. Heavy stuff goes into this slag. Now, the even more dangerous thing about what they're proposing with these is that this slag, instead of dumping that into a landfill, what they want to use that slag for is aggregate for basically like road building, or as to be used in concrete for construction of buildings. So now you're going to have all of this concrete that is contaminated with heavy metals and other toxics that are going to be in construction materials all over the place. And every time they tear up a road, they're going to disperse this toxic-laden dust and expose everyone and the groundwater over and over again to this toxic-laden concrete. That's probably about the worst thing you could possibly imagine doing. And so that's what they're proposing to do with the slag aggregate, making aggregate out of this slag. On the gas side of it, they want to siphon off the lighter atoms as a gas. They use some of those atoms to reconstruct into an artificial or synthetic natural gas that they end up burning then as a fuel source. But you still have some of these atoms that go off in the gas that are the classic contributors to toxic emissions. You still have the same halogens, the chlorine, the fluorine, the bromine, etc., that contribute to the formation of dioxins, because those atoms that they don't use for making the synthetic gas end up going off as a waste product that ends up getting burned, combusted in the same old way as the old-fashioned traditional incineration as the Detroit incinerator, with all the same problems of the emissions that come from it. So a lot of times those who are promoting these facilities will say, oh, there's no emissions. Well, if you say, and they'll say that there's no emissions because there's no combustion. Okay, but that's only true because they draw a circle around the one part of it, the plasma arc, the pyrolysis chamber, that doesn't have oxygen. So there is no combustion that happens there in that chamber. But it does happen in a secondary process down the line. So if you draw a circle around that one chamber with the plasma arc or the pyrolysis, there isn't any combustion there, but it happens in a later stage. So it's well, let's just say for those who are promoting it, it's an inconvenient truth that they still have the same emissions.
Joel?